Hi there, I'm David Busch and this is Busch History, and we are continuing our march through American history. I am up to topic 21, World War II. Topic 21, number 2. There are 2 presentations on World War II. Presentation 1 was a broad overview using a PowerPoint presentation on the world aspects of World War II and a strong focus on the United States participation in World War II. Topic 2 is going to take a look at the conferences that are held during the war and that set up the post-war world, and a series of questions and the appropriate answers for those questions about World War II, kind of like a homework assignment look. So let me cue it up and I'll be right with you. What we have is a series of conferences that occur before and during the war. This is available on my website in the YouTube folder for topic 21. I'm not sure how well it shows up on the video, but there are a series of conferences. And let's take a look and I'll talk through them a bit. We have the Atlantic Conference, which is in August of 1941. And that's before the United States enters the war, but the war in Europe is raging on. We have the Casablanca Conference, which is January 12th to the 23rd, 1943, and you guessed it, it's in Northern Africa. We have the Moscow Conference in October of 1943, and you guessed it, it's in Moscow. We have the Cairo Conference in November of 1943. We have the Teheran Conference from late November to December 1943. We have the Yalta Conference, February 1945, and we have the Potsdam Conference in July into early August of 1945. For the most part, most American history courses deal with 3 of these conferences. They all have a significance, but most of American history courses deal with the last one, Potsdam. Yalta, they often say, is the big one, because that divides Europe, and a lot of them deal with the Atlantic Conference as well, because that sets up the post-war world, meaning it sets up what happens when the war is over. I'd actually like to take a look at all of them with a little more emphasis on the 3 conferences, those 3 big conferences, because each one of them is important. Each one is some kind of turning point in world diplomacy. So let's take a look. The Atlantic Conference, August 12th to 14th, 1941. The only people who are there are FDR and Winston Churchill. It's held in secret on the Atlantic Ocean. And it occurs before we enter the war, before the United States enters the war. Why would we be in a conference 5 months before we enter the war? And tie that to, why is the Pacific Fleet in the middle of the Pacific Ocean as opposed to being in San Diego, which is his home port? Just think about that one. Anyway, the Atlantic Charter is signed. The Atlantic Charter is the framework for the United Nations. And we know what the United Nations is all about. It's about the post-war world. Wait a minute. Aren't we supposed to be isolationist? Makes you wonder. Anyway, it says there'll be no territorial expansion. No territorial change without consent of the inhabitants. And self-determination of nations. But who are we in the summer of 1941? We are the United States. And FDR is planning to get involved in the war. He doesn't know when, he doesn't know where, or we like to believe that, but nevertheless, he is planning it. So now take a look. Let's go to Casablanca in 1943. Well, let's see now, it's FDR and Winston Churchill. Again, Casablanca is in Morocco, which is in northern Africa. And we know at this time that Hitler is in both Europe and northern Africa. We can't meet in Europe yet because we don't have a real strong foothold in Europe. But we will meet in northern Africa. And an agreement occurs there between Churchill and Stalin to accept nothing less than unconditional. So in Moscow, we have Chiang Kai-shek, Joe Stalin, FDR, and Winston Churchill. Wow, the big 4. They're there. Because, well, Chiang Kai-shek is there because of what Japanese are doing in China. Joseph Stalin because, well, his buddy Hitler has changed his mind and attacked him, and the Battle of Stalingrad has been going on. So what happens here is we get the 4 strongest leaders in the world meeting to discuss what's going to happen when the war is over. And what they do is they come up with the idea of the United Nations that they're going to do that. We all agree to this. They affirm the idea of unconditional surrenders. that after the termination of hostilities, they will not employ their military force within the territories of other states, except for the purposes envisioned in the declaration and after joint consultation. That means that when the war is over, the armies that are in the occupied territories are not going to be used against the civilians, and of course they shouldn't be. Italy. It is essential the Italian government should be made more democratic by inclusion of representatives of those sections of the Italian people who have always opposed fascism. They're also going to try to make Italy much more democratic and allow for greater toleration, because the fascists were not all about toleration. We start to address the idea of the atrocities of the Holocaust, and that war criminals will be punished. And all of this is decided at the Moscow Conference. If you ignore these lesser conferences, you don't understand the seeds of some of these issues. Because if you ignore Casablanca, you don't know about the unconditional surrender thing. If you ignore Moscow, like a lot of people do, you don't get the idea of, we're going to punish war criminals. And all of the nations agreed to do this. All of the big four that are heading the Allied powers agreed to do this. Now we go to Cairo. In November of 1943, again, FDR, Winston Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek. If you're noticing, the constant in all of these is FDR and Churchill. I don't know if they're close friends, but they certainly have a lot to do with each other. It's in Cairo, and Korea is going to be independent at the end of the war, because Korea had been controlled by the Japanese. Now want an independent Korea. It's also, with Chiang Kai-shek there, it means that China is not going to control Korea either. During the war, we have an interesting relationship with China. Chiang calls himself the head of a democratic nation, but he's not really terribly democratic. As a matter of fact, Mao was waiting in the wings for the 1949 revolution. But nevertheless, the whole idea that Korea is going to be independent at the end of the war is a big deal. Because you know it doesn't fully work out that way, because North Korea is heavily influenced by China. And it's going to lead to the Korean War. The Teheran Conference in November and December 1943. Well, now we have FDR, Churchill, and Stalin. And they agree they're going to open up a second front in Europe, which is what Stalin has been wanting for a long time. He wants a full-scale invasion in Europe so it can take the heat off of the Germans fighting at the Soviet border. Churchill has been delaying this. Churchill is still very angry at Stalin for the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, but they finally agreed to a second front. Now, they agreed to this, by the way, in 1943, in December of 1943, because D-Day is already being planned. So Stalin doesn't know it's being planned. They're agreeing to something they already agreed to do anyway. You talk about subterfuge and being sneakery. Sneakery? I like that word. Now, we get to the big one that most people cover in great detail, Yalta. Yalta in 1945. FDR, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin. This is the last conference that FDR is at, and FDR is certainly looking very ill at this conference by some of the pictures that we see of him. Nevertheless, the big thing that happens at Yalta is they agreed to divide Germany into 4 zones. I'd like to draw a picture of that and show you what I'm talking about, so let's pause here for a second. At Yalta, it's believed that the way to keep Germany from being an aggressor again is to divide up Germany. Yes, I know Germany's not a square, but it's easier for the representation. So you're going to take 4 pieces, and you're going to have the piece with the Soviet Union, the piece with France, the piece with Great Britain, and the piece with the USA. And each one will govern part of Germany in the post-war years. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to look at this. Just like Sesame Street, one of these is not like the other. Who's not going to get along here? Got it. The Soviet Union is not going to get along. And in the middle of the Soviet Union's piece will be Berlin, the capital of Germany. And when you control the capital in those days, you control the country. So that's going to lead to all kinds of trouble later on in the Cold War, when these 3 will unite into West Germany, and this section will be called East Germany, heavily controlled by the Soviet Union. So that's a big deal. Let's get back to the rest of the conference. It's also agreed at Yalta that there'll be free elections in Eastern Europe. Countries can set up their own governments, and that troops will withdraw and allow these people sovereignty. Remember the whole self-determination thing. Okay, well, something strange can happen, because then at Potsdam, after FDR dies, Stalin's going to change his mind. Look who's here. We have Harry Truman and Joseph Stalin. Harry Truman's a new guy. Joseph Stalin had no respect for Harry Truman. And Clement Attlee and Winston Churchill. Why Clement Attlee? Clement Attlee is the new Prime Minister of England. Churchill had been a wartime Prime Minister, and the whole idea was he would step down when the war was over. And sure enough, the war in Europe was over. So Clement Attlee is there, and Winston Churchill is simply as an advisor. So the only person that's got any juice at this table is Joe Stalin. And what does he announce in Potsdam? No free elections in Europe. He changes his mind. So while he's changing his mind publicly at Potsdam, Harry Truman is scheming against him privately, wanting to use the atomic bomb. So the Cold War that we know, starting here. It's starting here with what's going to happen in the post-war world. Unconditional surrender by Japan to face prompt and utter destruction? Sure. But remember, Truman doesn't want unconditional surrender, even though he knows that they're trying to surrender. And Stalin doesn't want unconditional surrender, even though he knows. If they surrender, Stalin can't take land. If they surrender, Truman can't use the atomic bomb to show the Soviet Union what we've got. How's that for playing games with people's lives? Okay, I'd like to show you now a series of questions and answers on World War II. So let me get that ready. This is a homework assignment that I've used many times. It's a series of questions and answers on the war. And I'd like to just walk through with it here. Here we go. What was the purpose of the Lend-Lease program, and how did it benefit the Allies? Well, the purpose simply was to provide Britain with a way to fight Germany. France had fallen, Britain was standing alone against Germany's aggression, and FDR had not yet put us into World War II. So now we are simply going to provide the weapons to Britain to help fight Germany. How did the policy of Lend-Lease bring us closer to war? Well, we're choosing a side, for one, and we're gearing up our military, for two. Why was the Atlantic Charter important? It set up the post-war world, and it showed that the United States was now going to be a player on the world stage as opposed to being isolationist. What were Japanese demands prior to Pearl Harbor, and how did the U.S. react? Well, the Japanese wanted to control Asia. They wanted European countries out of Asia, and they wanted to dominate where once the Europeans dominated. So the Japanese didn't free Asia from the Asians, or take Asia from the Asians, I should say. The Japanese took Asia, in their minds, from the Europeans. And of course, the reaction ultimately, when the Japanese invaded Indochina, which we call Vietnam, was FDR turning off the faucet. We're not going to sell them any more oil, we're not going to sell them any more scrap iron. How did the racial and gender composition of the U.S. military change during World War II? Well, we now have women in the military. They're not fighting, but they are in major support roles. WACs and WAVES, the Women's Army Corps, and the WAVES are women in the Navy and all kinds of support roles. And we have African Americans. We have African Americans, still a lot of racism, There are African American soldiers. The numbers are getting better, there's no doubt about it. But African Americans are mostly relegated to second-class status during the war. Labor unions. Well, whereas the New Deal has supported labor unions, the government during World War II supported labor unions as long as they behaved. There was an anti-strike bill passed. Labor unions were not allowed to strike. In what ways was the government involved in the wartime economy? Every way. Production had quotas on production. Resources could only be used for certain things. Wages were locked. All kinds of ways the United States government was involved in the economy. What impact did the Office of Scientific Research and Development have on the war? Well, that, ladies and gentlemen, is the atomic bomb, hence the Manhattan Project. The U.S. fights in Europe and in Africa. What were the first important decisions made by the British and the American alliance, and why? Remember, that was at the Atlantic Charter and the Atlantic Conference, and the Atlantic Charter comes from that, and it was Europe first. And why Europe first? Well, remember, Japan had not yet attacked the United States. Things may have been a little different if Japan had already attacked the United States, and we had a strong alliance with Britain. So that strong alliance with Britain simply meant that we would be in Europe first. The polar bear route was a major supply route across northern Europe. Dangerous because of the weather, frankly. How did Hitler avoid capture by the Soviets? He committed suicide in the bunker in Berlin while the Soviet army was advancing. VE Day, May 8th, 1945, that is the day that is known for victory over Europe, and it's 3 weeks after Franklin Roosevelt dies. The Allies in the Pacific. How did Japan's victories in Southeast Asia influence attitudes about white rule? Well, the whites couldn't protect the Chinese. They couldn't protect the Filipinos, and they couldn't protect the people in Indochina, Vietnam, from Japanese aggression. So this whole idea of white man's superiority over the yellow man, quote unquote, term for the day, not politically correct, but it was a term that was used. This whole idea that white man was superior, completely blown out of the water as the Japanese marched through Asia. What was unique about the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway? They were complete naval battles. They were ships against ships. Kind of like, you can imagine as children, people might have done things like this, or some of the games, some of the video games that are used, where it wasn't soldier against soldier. So they were anonymous battles. Sure, bloody, horrible battles, lots of soldiers killed, but you didn't directly look at the enemy, you looked at the enemy's ship. Very interesting, very different, very impersonal. Where is Guadalcanal? It's in the South Pacific, and what military significance did it possess for the United States? It was halfway to Japan, and we needed it as a major refueling and supply area if we were ever going to invade Japan. The Enola Gay. The Enola Gay is the plane that Paul Tibbets was flying when he dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The Allies in the post-war world. Why was the question of Poland's sovereignty an issue at Yalta? Well, twice the Germans had invaded the Soviet Union, had attacked the Soviet Union by marching across Poland. Poland has a lot of flat lands, the plains of Poland. And there was a thought that the Soviet Union would try to leave a standing army in Poland to protect itself, an iron curtain, it would later be called, to protect itself from Germany. So at Yalta, it was decided there'd be free elections in Poland after the war, and that Stalin would not turn around and occupy Poland. Well, that didn't hold. So what decisions were made at Yalta? Well, we're going to divide up Germany into 4 zones, a firm unconditional surrender, free elections in Europe, and armies would be withdrawn. Stalin ignored most of that later on. At Potsdam, Stalin announced a change. What was it and how did it affect post-war Europe? The big change was no free elections. What it meant for post-war Europe was all of the nations that the Soviet Union had liberated would become the Iron Curtain nations, dominated by the Soviet Union, or satellite nations as they are sometimes called. And how did the treatment of Japan differ from the treatment of Germany after World War II? Japan had an occupation, and Germany had a rebuilding. Japan was not rebuilt with the tremendous funds that were used in Europe. Europe had many countries, and it was feared that if we did not rebuild Europe with things like the Marshall Plan, that there might be a division in Europe, and some may go towards the Soviet Union. Those ideas did not occur in Japan. We had an occupation army in Japan, and Japan was rebuilt. And the United States wrote the Japanese Constitution forbidding war, and as a result of that, over a period of time, the Japanese became close friends. We let the emperor stay in power. We dismantled the German government. We let the emperor stay in power, and he became useful in the post-war occupation of Japan. In both cases, Japan and Germany were handled well. Infrastructure was left intact in Germany, and certain high-ranking officials were used in Germany to help during the rebuild as well. Not every German was a Nazi. That's sometimes forgotten. There were people who were They had crimes of conscience more than anything else. They didn't agree with what Hitler was doing. There were many attempts against Hitler's life by Germans. So we can't take a real broad brushstroke with all of this. Anyway, World War II is complicated because World War II doesn't end with a build down, and it doesn't end with this long period of we don't want to get involved again by the United States. It ends with us entering the Cold War. And it's the only war in American history that doesn't have a post-war depression or recession, because we end World War II, and as you're going to see in the next presentation, we're getting ready for World War III with the Cold War. So for today, this is Busch History, and I will see you next time with topic 22, which will begin the Cold War. Have a good day.